you guys hear that?
Welcome to Bleak Nights, where every story hides a heartbeat you shouldn't hear. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, like, and share, and tell us in the comments, which city or country are you watching from? You never know. The next story might be yours. There's something about fall that makes the world feel different after midnight. Maybe it's the way the air turns sharp and cold, or how the leaves crunch under your feet like brittle bones. Maybe it's the way the darkness seems to settle in a little deeper, swallowing up the familiar and making even the most ordinary places feel strange. Whatever it is, the hours after midnight in autumn have a way of drawing out the things we'd rather not see. The secrets, the shadows, the stories that never quite make sense in the light of day. Tonight, I'm sharing 4 true stories of what happens after midnight in fall. These aren't just tales to make you jump at shadows. They're reminders that sometimes the scariest things are the ones that happen when the world is supposed to be asleep. The first story comes from a girl named Riley, who grew up in a small town in Vermont. Riley always loved fall, the way the trees turned gold and red, the smell of wood smoke in the air, the promise of Halloween just around the corner. But the year she turned 16, something happened that changed the way she felt about autumn nights forever. It started on a Friday in late October. Riley's parents were out of town for the weekend and she was home alone for the first time. She wasn't nervous, she'd always been independent, and their house was in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen. She spent the evening watching scary movies, texting her friends, and eating too much popcorn. By midnight, she was curled up on the couch, half asleep, when she heard a noise outside. At first, she thought it was just the wind. The old maple tree in the front yard always creaked when the weather turned cold. But then she heard it again, a soft, deliberate tapping on the window. Riley sat up, her heart pounding. She told herself it was probably a branch, but the tapping was too regular, too intentional. She crept over to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing. The porch light cast a small pool of yellow on the steps, but beyond that, everything was swallowed by shadow. She was about to turn away when she saw movement. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. It was tall and thin, with a hood pulled up over its head. Riley froze, watching as the figure slowly raised a hand and tapped on the glass again. She stumbled back, grabbing her phone and dialing her best friend, Emma. Emma answered on the second ring, her voice groggy. Riley whispered what was happening, her voice shaking. Emma told her to lock all the doors and call the police, but Riley couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, watching as the figure stepped forward into the light. That's when she saw the mask. It was a cheap plastic Halloween mask, the kind you buy at the dollar store, but there was something wrong about it. The eyes were too wide, the mouth twisted into a grin that looked more like a snarl. The figure pressed its face against the glass, fogging it up with its breath. Riley finally snapped out of her trance and ran to the front door, making sure it was locked. She checked the back door, the windows, every possible entrance. The figure circled the house, tapping on each window as it went. Riley could hear its footsteps crunching through the leaves, slow and deliberate. She called the police, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. The dispatcher told her to stay on the line and stay somewhere safe. Riley locked herself in the bathroom, sitting on the floor with her back against the door. She could hear the tapping, moving from room to room, always just out of sight. It felt like hours before the police arrived, though it was probably only 20 minutes. When they pulled up, the tapping stopped. Riley heard footsteps running away, crashing through the bushes. The officers searched the yard but found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Riley's parents came home the next morning and she tried to convince herself it had all been a bad dream. But when she went outside, she found something that made her blood run cold. On the porch, right where the figure had been standing, was the mask. It was lying face up, the plastic warped and cracked, the grin still twisted and wide. Riley never found out who had been outside her window that night, or what they wanted. But every fall, when the leaves start to turn and the nights grow long, she remembers the sound of tapping on the glass and the feeling of being watched after midnight. If you've ever found yourself awake after midnight in the fall, you know there's a different kind of silence that settles over the world. It's not just quiet. It's expectant, as if the darkness itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Maybe that's why so many strange things seem to happen when the clock strikes 12 and the leaves are falling. Maybe that's why the next story still haunts the person who lived it, years after the fact. This story comes from a guy named Marcus who grew up in a suburb outside of Chicago. Marcus was the kind of person who never really believed in anything supernatural. He liked scary movies, but he always rolled his eyes at ghost stories and urban legends. He was logical, practical, and convinced that everything had a rational explanation, until the night he learned that some things just can't be explained away. It was the first week of November, and the air had that sharp, smoky smell that only comes after the last bonfires of Halloween. Marcus was 17, a senior in high school, and he'd just gotten his first car, a beat-up old Honda that rattled every time he turned the key. That Friday night, his parents were out at a late dinner and Marcus was home alone, finishing up some homework and half watching a horror movie on TV. Around midnight, he realized he was hungry and decided to drive to the all-night diner a few miles away. The roads were empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Marcus rolled down the window, letting the cold air wake him up as he drove. The diner was nearly empty when he got there. Just a couple of truckers at the counter and a waitress who looked like she'd been working since the dawn of time. He ordered a burger and fries, ate quickly, and paid in cash. By the time he got back in his car, it was almost 1 a.m. The drive home was even quieter than before. Marcus took a shortcut through a neighborhood he didn't usually drive through, a winding road lined with old houses and towering oak trees. The leaves had piled up along the curbs, and every so often a gust of wind would send them swirling across the headlights. As he turned onto a particularly dark stretch of road, his headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing at the edge of the street. At first, Marcus thought it was just someone out for a late walk, but as he got closer, he realized there was something off about the way the person was standing. They were perfectly still, facing away from the road, their head tilted at an unnatural angle. Marcus slowed down, his heart starting to race for reasons he couldn't explain. As he passed, the figure turned to look at him. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was wearing a long, old-fashioned dress that looked out of place in the modern neighborhood. Marcus's skin prickled with goosebumps as he drove past, but he tried to shake it off. Probably just someone in a weird costume, he told himself. Maybe a leftover from a Halloween party. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the woman step into the street and start walking after his car. Not running, just walking, but somehow keeping pace with him even as he sped up. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He pressed the gas, trying to put some distance between himself and the woman. But every time he looked back, she was still there, her face illuminated by the red glow of his taillights. He turned onto another street, then another, taking random turns in an attempt to lose her. But no matter where he went, the woman was always there, just at the edge of the headlights, her dress fluttering in the wind. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, that he was tired and seeing things, but the fear was real. Finally, he pulled into his driveway, jumped out of the car and ran inside, slamming the door behind him. He locked every door and window, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He peeked through the blinds, half expecting to see the woman standing in the yard, but the street was empty. Marcus tried to calm down, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, just a weird coincidence. But that night, as he lay in bed, he heard footsteps outside his window. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. He held his breath, listening as the footsteps circled the house, pausing every so often as if someone was looking in. Marcus wanted to call the police, but what would he say? That he was being followed by a ghost in a dress? The footsteps eventually faded away, and Marcus finally fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, he found a single, muddy footprint on the porch, too small to be his, and in a place where no one should have been able to reach without triggering the motion sensor light. He never saw the woman again, but every fall, when the nights grow long and the leaves start to pile up, Marcus remembers the feeling of being followed after midnight and the sound of footsteps in the dark. Some stories stick with you not because of what you saw, but because of what you felt. The kind of fear that lingers long after the night is over. The kind that makes you question what's real and what's just your mind playing tricks. The next story is one of those. It comes from a woman named Priya, who spent her college years in a small town in upstate New York, surrounded by forests that seemed to swallow the world whole once the sun went down. Priya was a junior that fall, living in a creaky old house with 3 other students. The house was cheap, drafty, and always smelled faintly of old books and damp leaves. But it was close to campus, and the rent was unbeatable. Her roommates were out of town for the weekend, so Priya had the place to herself. She planned to spend the night catching up on reading, maybe baking something, and enjoying the rare silence. It was just after midnight when she heard the first sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the back door. At first, she thought it was just a branch in the wind, but the tapping was too steady, too intentional. She tried to ignore it, but it kept going, a slow, persistent knock that seemed to echo through the empty house. Priya finally got up, wrapped herself in a sweater, and went to check. She flipped on the porch light and peered through the window. There was nothing there, just the backyard, shrouded in mist, the trees swaying in the wind. She locked the door again and tried to laugh it off, telling herself she was just being paranoid. But the tapping started again, this time at the kitchen window. Priya's heart pounded as she crept over and looked out. Again, nothing. The yard was empty, the only movement the shadows cast by the swaying branches. She closed the curtains and tried to focus on her book, but the sense of unease wouldn't go away. She decided to distract herself by baking. She put on some music, preheated the oven, and started mixing ingredients. For a while it worked. The familiar motions, the warmth of the kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and sugar. But then, just as she was pouring batter into a pan, the music stopped. The speakers crackled, then went silent. Priya's phone was still playing music, so she knew it wasn't the Wi-Fi. She checked the speaker, but it was fine. She tried to turn it back on, but nothing happened. The silence felt heavy, pressing in on her from all sides. That's when she heard it, a whisper, so soft she almost missed it. It sounded like her name, carried on the wind, coming from somewhere outside. Priya froze, her hands covered in flour, listening. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, unmistakable. "Priya!" She backed away from the window, her heart racing. She grabbed her phone and called her boyfriend, who lived across town. He answered, groggy and confused, but when she told him what was happening, he promised to come over right away. Priya locked every door and window, turned on every light in the house, and sat in the living room, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The whispering continued, sometimes right outside the window, sometimes from the back door, sometimes from the shadows at the edge of the yard. Priya tried to tell herself it was just the wind, just her imagination, but the fear was real. She could feel it crawling up her spine, making her skin prickle. After what felt like an eternity, her boyfriend arrived. He searched the yard, the porch, the alley behind the house, but found nothing. He stayed with her the rest of the night, and the whispering finally stopped. But when Priya went outside the next morning, she found something that made her blood run cold. A single, perfect handprint on the kitchen window, pressed into the condensation. It was too large to be hers, and the fingers were long, almost inhuman. Priya never figured out what had happened that night. She tried to rationalize it, to tell herself it was just a trick of the wind, just a prank, just her mind playing games. But every fall, when the nights grow long and the wind starts to whisper through the trees, she remembers the sound of her name being called after midnight and the feeling that something was waiting for her in the dark. Some stories don't have neat endings. Some fears never really go away. Priya moved out of that house at the end of the semester, but she never forgot what happened. She still avoids being alone after midnight in the fall, and she never leaves her windows unlocked. There's a reason so many cultures have stories about things that come out after dark. About voices that call your name from the shadows, about the dangers of being alone when the world is asleep. Maybe those stories are just old superstitions, or maybe they're warnings, reminders that the world is a stranger place than we like to admit, and that sometimes the things we fear most are the ones we can't see. The last story I'm about to share is one that's been told and retold in whispers, passed around campfires and late-night group chats, but this version comes straight from the person who lived it. It's a story about what happens when curiosity gets the better of you. When you ignore that little voice in your head telling you to turn back, and when you realize, too late, that some doors should never be opened after midnight in the fall. This story belongs to a guy named Ethan, who grew up in a rural part of Pennsylvania. The kind of place where the woods seem endless, the roads are narrow and winding, and the only sounds at night are the wind and the distant calls of owls. Ethan was used to the quiet, used to the darkness, and he'd always thought of himself as someone who didn't scare easily. But one October night, that changed. It was the weekend before Halloween, and Ethan and his two best friends, Tyler and Gabe, were hanging out in Ethan's basement playing video games and eating leftover pizza. The air outside was cold and damp, and the wind rattled the windows. Around midnight, Tyler suggested they go for a walk in the woods behind Ethan's house. "Let's see if we can find the old cabin," he said, grinning. The cabin was a local legend, supposedly abandoned for decades, hidden deep in the trees, and haunted by the ghost of a man who disappeared there years ago. Ethan hesitated. He'd heard the stories, but he'd never actually seen the cabin. Still, he didn't want to look like a coward in front of his friends. So they grabbed flashlights, pulled on their jackets, and headed out into the night. The woods were darker than Ethan remembered, the trees pressing in on all sides, their branches creaking in the wind. The only light came from their flashlights, which cast long, jittery shadows on the ground. They followed a narrow path, crunching through fallen leaves, their breath visible in the cold air. For a while they joked and laughed, trying to scare each other with ghost stories. But as they got deeper into the woods, the laughter faded, replaced by a tense silence. After what felt like an hour, they found it. The cabin, half collapsed and covered in moss, its windows dark and empty. The door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking in the wind. Tyler dared Ethan to go inside first. Ethan took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of rot and mildew. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He swept his flashlight around the room, illuminating broken furniture, shattered glass, and graffiti scrawled on the walls. Gabe and Tyler followed, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They explored the cabin, their nerves on edge. In one corner, Ethan found a pile of old newspapers, yellowed and brittle with age. He picked one up and shined his light on the headline, "Local Man Missing, Last Seen Near Old Cabin." The date was October 31st, 1978. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the cabin. The boys froze, their flashlights trembling. "Probably just an animal," Gabe whispered, but his voice shook. Ethan moved toward the sound, his heart pounding. He pushed open a door at the back of the cabin and found himself staring into a small, windowless room. In the center of the room was a chair, and on the chair was a mask, an old cracked Halloween mask, its features twisted into a grotesque grin. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw something move in the shadows behind the chair. He stepped back, bumping into Tyler, who was right behind him. That's when they heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from the darkness. "Get out!" The boys didn't wait to see what would happen next. They bolted from the cabin, crashing through the trees, their flashlights bouncing wildly. They didn't stop running until they were back at Ethan's house, breathless and shaking. They tried to laugh it off, telling themselves it was just their imaginations, just the wind, just an old house settling in the night. But when Ethan went to bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them out of the woods. He lay awake, listening to the wind, the creak of the house, the distant sound of leaves rustling outside his window. The next morning, Ethan found muddy footprints on the porch, too large to be his or his friends, and leading straight up to his bedroom window. He never went back to the cabin, and he never talked about what happened that night again. But every fall, when the air turns cold and the woods grow dark, he remembers the feeling of being watched, the sound of that whisper, and the knowledge that some places are better left alone after midnight. These 4 stories are reminders that the world changes after midnight in the fall. The familiar becomes strange, The safe becomes dangerous, and the things we think we know are replaced by shadows and whispers. Maybe it's just the season, the way the darkness settles in, or maybe it's something deeper, something that's always been there, waiting for us to let our guard down. If you ever find yourself awake after midnight in the fall, pay attention to the silence. Listen for the footsteps, the tapping on the glass, the voice that calls your name from the darkness. And remember, some stories are true, even if you wish they weren't. Maybe you're listening to these stories with the lights on, or maybe you're brave enough to let the darkness settle around you as you press play. Either way, you're part of a long tradition. People gathering to share what they've seen, what they've felt, and what they can't quite explain. There's a reason we tell these stories, especially as the nights grow longer and the air turns cold. It's not just about fear, it's about connection, about warning, about remembering that the world is bigger and stranger than we want to believe. So the next time you find yourself walking home under a canopy of bare branches, or you hear a sound at your window when the clock strikes midnight, don't be so quick to brush it off. Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe it's the start of a story you'll never forget. After all, every fall, someone somewhere is living the next tale that will be whispered in the dark, retold to friends, or shared with strangers online. Maybe the next story is already unfolding, just waiting for someone to listen. If you've ever had a night like these, one that changed the way you see the world after midnight, share it in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it. And remember, on bleak nights, every story hides a heartbeat you shouldn't hear. Sleep well, if you can.